Yes.
All right, shall we begin?
Yes, we can start.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third lecture in SIC lecture series. Today we have with us Dr. Ajay Parashram. Ajay is an associate professor in the University of Dalhousie. He describes himself as transnational, multi-generational byproduct of empire, and this is central to his research and teaching. Working broadly around the theme of the colonial present, Ajay studies structural forms of violence, for example, race, caste, class, patriarchy, etc., rooted or exasperated through imperial encounters that have been sanitized of their colonial histories and normalized in the present day. At the moment, he is working on three primary areas of research. The first one is a book on the subject of pluriversal sovereignty, focusing on 19th century Sri Lanka and its entanglements as part of the British Empire. The second concerns settler colonial studies and decolonial options, grounded in the life as immigrants of Mikamaki. And the third is a 4-year SSHRC Inside grant funded project studying experiences of racialization of Asian international students to Canadian universities, where he works as the co-investigator and project lead for the Halifax case. He is also cross-appointed to the Departments of International Development Studies, History, and Political Science, and he is interested in working with the graduate students interested in similar and related themes. Today, his talk is titled Decolonizing Sovereignty, Pluriversal Options from South Asia and Turtle Island. We are very happy to have you here, Ajay. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Srinath, for that kind introduction. You really did your homework on that bio. Thank you for that. Well, welcome everybody. It's so wonderful to see people popping in from many different geographical locations, and we're going to spend some time today with the maps. I'm hearing a bit of echo from someone, so maybe you could mute Liam. I think it might be you. Thanks for coming, Liam. There we go. All right. So yeah, thank you for joining me in your late afternoon, your early morning, and every time zone in between. I decided to write my comments today to try to keep me on track. I don't want to just ramble for ages, but I could talk about this subject literally forever. I feel like I have been in some ways. And I want to start by expressing my thanks and gratitude to my colleagues, Srinath and Anandita, for proposing that we collaborate on the speaker series in the first place, and for doing really all the heavy lifting and all of the organizing. Thank you also to the Indian Institute for Science Education and Research in Bhopal and the Sastri Indo-Canadian Institute for sponsoring the series, and honestly for the generations of work that's gone into developing the intellectual and academic connections between India and Canada. I think we honor that tradition when we can work together on these issues. I benefited from the Sastri Institute before when I was a graduate student, also with other organizations dedicated to building close ties between Canada and India, including the Kanta Marwa Fellowship at Carleton University, the South Asian Studies Institute at the University of the Fraser Valley in the western part of Canada, the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, where I worked for 2 years in between my studies, and many more institutions. The sprawling notion of the South Asian diaspora is extremely important for me, in part because, as Srinath noted, I identify as a transnational, multi-generational byproduct of the British Empire. And what I mean by that is to situate myself as the descendant of indentured laborers from various parts of India who were essentially starved out of the country by waves of British political economic planning, or maybe, to be more precise, the lack of British political economic planning. They were urged to stop producing food and demanded instead, asked us to produce textiles so that they could trade with Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, etc., all in the name of improvement, all in the name of development, and civilization at a period in the British Empire when they fancied themselves the enders of slavery rather than the chief beneficiaries of slavery. My ancestors, at least the ones that I can trace, crossed the Kalapani without knowing exactly where they would end up and if they would ever come home. Some made it back home to India. Others stayed. My ancestors stayed in an island called Kairi. No one would know it now by the name Kairi because it was misnamed by a lost European sailor named Columbus, who arrogantly renamed the indigenous island Trinidad. So Trinidad and its sister island Tobago is the southernmost of the Caribbean island chain in the British Caribbean. The waves of genocide preceded African slavery on that island, and through that those violent processes, the establishment of the sugar plantations came about. And after Africans in Haiti and elsewhere in the British Caribbean, well, across the Caribbean, not just the British Caribbean, when they proved that their freedom was non-negotiable, the British sought to undermine their efforts of withholding their labor on plantations by importing what they saw as cheap and docile and non-problematic Asian labor from India, which I think, although directly implicates me, implicates all of us who are South Asian in terms of the discursive representations of race that go into that particular kind of process. And the result of this economically was that South Asians and Africans found themselves at odds with each other through their economic location relative to the means of production. And the only people who benefited from this particular kind of imperial conflict were the white planters and their descendants, many of whom were enjoying reparations at the time for their loss of human property, while whining and complaining to the colonial office endlessly about the suffering they endure on behalf of the empire, king and country. So from there, after several generations, my family immigrated to Canada, which we were taught at the time was a white Christian country full of peacekeeping do-gooders that didn't do anything wrong aside from maybe saying sorry too much. But, and I'll show you, I mean, probably all of you have seen a picture of Canada, but I want to show you some of the areas I'm talking about here. The reality was a lot different than the immigration brochures promised. We landed originally in Algonquin territories. I think you can see here around the city of Ottawa, in the national capital, where the national parliament squats illegally on stolen and unceded Algonquin territory, and very close to some sacred waterfalls in that city that served as a great source of medicine for Algonquin people, as well as a natural highway to Indigenous people coming from as far up this river here. This is a massive river that goes all the way to the sea. People would travel all through here, and they could get all the way into Ottawa and continue on. So it was like a natural highway without the need for cars, as Algonquin scholar Lingell explains in her book, The Truth That Wampum Tells. And I'm speaking to you right now from here in the eastern part of the country called Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation and its many peoples. I grew up here. I later moved as a young adult all the way across the country to Coast Salish territories in and around this area here. And it was here in Coast Salish territories where my education about colonialism and anti-colonialism became practice-driven, as well as an academic pursuit. So to zoom in a little bit here on Mi'kma'ki, here you can see this is a map that comes from Mi'kmaq historian Dan Paul's book, We Were Not the Savages. And it shows you the geographical regions of Mi'kma'ki. And the thing I want to point out to you on this slide here is how this map doesn't equate to this map. In fact, if you overlayer them, the territories are quite different, and Mi'kma'ki spreads into this island here that in the colonial language we call Prince Edward Island, and this one here called New Brunswick. And I'll speak to that in a second. I grew up in Mi'kma'ki, but I didn't know that I grew up in Mi'kma'ki. because I believe the settler colonial story of Canada was an objective history. And it wasn't until I was an adult in my late 20s that I began to realize the ontological and epistemological violence grounded in a Eurocentricity that had been enacted on the territory itself as well as the people, and how that these colluding factors had created a condition in me, in my body, where even as an ostensibly anti-colonial researcher, I was in a situation where I did not know where I was. And that's why in my classes, when I ask my students at the beginning of class, the first question is always, no matter what the subject, where are you and how do you know? Because that fundamental question of where are you and how do you know speaks to first an ontology of sovereignty, and then the associated epistemology of how we come to know and value knowledge that tells us where we are. And that's something that I think has been really significant in shaping the way that I think, based on being here in a settler colony. So the Mi'kmaq have been on this land since the beginning of time. And as I've learned from reading, collaborating, and conspiring with my Mi'kmaq friends, colleagues, and comrades, in fact, one of them was supposed to be giving this lecture today instead of me, but at the not at the last minute. She gave lots of notice, but she couldn't make the commitment. But I'm here with her blessing as well to talk about this work. That's Professor Sherry Pictou, who I know some of you may know. So where was I here? Yes, the Mi'kmaq have been here since the beginning of time. And the significance of this presence and the making of a Mi'kmaq world over thousands of years is the vastly significant context that and that context historically, politically, and socially has been misunderstood either purposefully or ignorantly by successive waves of non-Indigenous settlers over the last 500 years. And I say non-Indigenous settlers because here I really mean more than just white people. These are all the newcomers. And for those of us, I speak for myself anyway, who immigrate, even as a person of color, we really do have a commitment to understanding where we are when we get into this, despite the fact that we're very deliberately misled, I think, by the government. So, nevertheless, the empirical reality of colonial history is that the British, and to a lesser extent the French, have territorialized parts of Mi'kma'ki and renamed it New Scotland or Nova Scotia, as the colonial map of the maritime provinces show here. And the logic of universal reasoning would tell us that we need to figure out which one of these two maps is true. But the truth is, there is a Mi'kmaq world and a contaminated British-esque Canadian world. And these two worlds occupy the very same place, albeit very different spaces. But unraveling the complexity around this is the inheritance of all of us who seek to live here, to study here, and to understand what colonialism and decolonization means from a place where colonization has never ended. It's normally when I give talks like this, I'm speaking to a mostly Canadian audience, and then I spend most of my time explaining South Asia, and it's kind of a treat to be able to do that in reverse here, where most of you obviously are familiar with the South Asian context, giving me a chance to focus a little bit more on what's happening here. But to put it in a bit of a comparative context now for everyone, 8 years before the Battle of Plassey that established the Company Raj in India in 1757, the city of Halifax was established. And that city of Halifax is right here. It's the capital of this province of the state. And this happened over top of the Mi'kmaq community of Chibuktuk, which means Great Harbor in the Mi'kmaq language. And I'm going to zoom in here so you can see, again, place really matters. I want to show you the geography of, this is open ocean here. And you can see it narrows in this territory and then opens into one of the biggest basins in the British Empire at the time. And where I am literally right now, I'm literally right here. So now you can triangulate exactly where I am when I say this is where I am and where I'm coming from. So as a recently deceased Mi'kmaq historian, Dan Paul, that I mentioned earlier, mentions in his book, We Were Not the Savages, for some 200 years, Mi'kmaq warriors met Europeans in battle here in Chibuktuk, in the Great Harbor, around which the modern-day city of Halifax is spread, and they prevented them from establishing a permanent settlement here until well into the 18th century. Halifax was established in no small part due to the policy decision of then British Governor Edward Cornwallis to pay a bounty on the scalps of Indigenous men, women, and children. Ever keen to monitor the imperial treasury, Cornwallis made sure he paid different amounts for the scalps of men, women, and children in a campaign of terror and genocide that sought to punish the Mi'kmaq for simply existing on their land. The punishment and the denial of the inherent rights of Indigenous people is much bigger than merely land rights, as I'm going to explain in the next part of my talk. But sufficient for our context now is to consider that, punishment for existing as Indigenous people on Indigenous territory is a key defining characteristic of settler colonial territoriality, which is a distinct form of colonial territoriality. And although it's worth noting that many post-colonial states, including India and Sri Lanka, are deploying territorial tactics of settler colonial expansion. And in this way, they have learned a lot, I think, from observing what settler colonies are able to get away with in the international community without facing sanction. In the settler colonies, the project was always about Indigenous erasure and land theft. And this land theft, this is work that the Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard and others have really done an amazing job of making accessible to us. And Coulthard's book, Redskins, White Mask, is one that I go back to. Sometimes I challenge myself to see if I could think or write anything at all without engaging that book in some sense. And so far, I've not succeeded. It's a really important one. But anyway, while land theft, of course, is something that matters a lot across all colonial contexts, and it played an important role in colonialism in South Asia, the processes were not the same. And in South Asia, it was oftentimes mediated by local elites in ways that it just didn't happen in that way in the settler colony. This is not to excuse any of the robbery and the brutality of the Company Raj or the British Raj, only to say that the way in which plunder operated was different. And those differences matter, I think, for understanding what would come later. In South Asia, the patronizing discourse of Orientalist knowledge presented European scholars and colonial administrators as learned men interested in resuscitating a long-gone ancient civilization on behalf of a subject people that were understood to be racially inferior, but very much present and perhaps even capable of one day becoming brown Englishmen. In the settler colonies, it was the very existence of Indigenous people that was the problem. And land theft was immediate, and they are ongoing, even though, technically this is not a British place anymore. Indigenous people were not seen as survivors of long-gone sophisticated civilizations the way that we were in South Asia. It was quite the opposite, in fact. As Anthony Angie, Anthony Pagnan, and Christina Rojas's work discussing various aspects of imperial history and the colonial international make clear, Indigenous people were often seen as a window into the Garden of Eden, or a European caricature of what the noble savage might have been, which of course has no bearing in reality, but it did help to rationalize land theft on their terms, on the premise of terra nullius, or civilizational backwardsness. Terra nullius is sometimes explained as the idea that Europeans said that they didn't see anything when they came here, but that's absurd because the land was full of human beings when Europeans arrived. What terra nullius, following Eva Maki and other scholars here, truly means was actually the discourse, a legal discourse of civilizational incompetency. So that was the discourse. It was that people were not sufficiently developed and able to use land in a productive way that justified their quote unquote ownership of land. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next section. But what I wanted to say about that here is that we see this ringing true in Canada, but also as a mode of settler colonialism elsewhere in settler colonies like Israel, where the vilification and collective punishment of the Palestinian people has already amounted to more than 30,000 dead in just a few months, while the leaders of the so-called free world continue to split hairs over whether such a horrendous and indefensible acts of violence constitutes a genocide, or if some other word is more appropriate. The connection between Israeli settler colonialism and genocide echoes Canada, particularly in the justification for land theft by dispossession. Israeli real estate companies are already advertising in Canada for prospective buyers in the occupied West Bank, and you can see the same pattern roll out in the destroyed Gaza Strip, all in due course. And as you perhaps know already, in India, Israel is keen to import Indian migrant workers to do the work that Palestinians, now killed, maimed, or driven from their homes, once did. So we see how the imperial global political economy continues to churn and support these forces of ongoing colonization. Fanon, never a man to mince his words, describes the colonial perception of Native society as such. Native society is not simply described as a society lacking in values. It is not enough for the colonists to affirm that those values have disappeared from, or still better, never existed in the colonial world. The native is declared insensible to ethics. He represents not only the absence of values, but also the negation of values. He is, let us dare to admit, the enemy of values. And in this sense, he is the absolute evil. That's Fanon from The Wretched of the Earth. As the late and great Indian historian Ranajit Guha, who we lost just less than a year ago, observed in his engagements with Hegelian world history, the British and other European empires that preceded them relied on the dictum that, quote, a people without writing are a people without history. And even though, as the Cherokee scholar Daniel Heath Justice explains in his book, Why Indigenous Literatures Matter, the claim that Indigenous people in the so-called New World did not have writing is indeed a colonial fiction, the sheer volume of written work and texts and histories on the Indian subcontinent forced a shift in colonial reason away from that old dictum to a revised one. And he spells this out in this book, History at the End of World History, where the colonial dictum becomes a people without the state are people without history. And that one really has been an important one for me, that insight. And it's anchored a lot of my research over the last 10, 15 years on around the question of how has the process of becoming the modern territorial nation state worked to legitimize and universalize Eurocentric notions of sovereignty while delegitimizing all others. And that question evolved. Originally it was much more, especially when I was a graduate student, it needed to be much more general so that I didn't presuppose, the Eurocentric one was the hegemonic one. I wanted to know what was the hegemonic one and how did it come to be. And since then I've learned and established and written about the fact that, well, it's very much a Eurocentric understanding, but it's not quite as simple as it sounds. So following the many threads that a question like this opens, it can take you in a number of different directions. And the one I'm going to focus on for the duration of our time together today is sovereignty, which is at the heart of the modern territorial state, but also a concept that with a much more diverse genealogy than the nation state allows. So the hegemonic story of sovereignty as it relates to the state tends to be a Eurocentric one. And while it has many possible twists and turns, it's relatively uncontroversial to tell it as the Westphalian story, where the treaties at Westphalia in the mid-1600s negotiated a common understanding of passive land, defendable borders, and the principle that countries are sovereign in terms of their ability to do whatever they want within their borders, but not outside of the borders. And there's nearly an ecumenical quality about this kind of state sovereignty, such that the famous scholar of international relations, Hans Morgenthau, describes sovereignty simply as a fact of international politics. Facts don't generally need investigation. And in my belief, when you hear assertions of things that are factual, it usually means we should put it under the microscope and figure out kind of what's going on there. So if sovereignty is indeed a fact of international politics, where did that fact come from? How did it become universally true? And I'm oversimplifying the history of sovereignty here. People have written tomes on the subject. But what I'm trying to draw attention to are the kinds of ontological leaps of faith that are necessary for any rational person to be able to accept that state sovereignty simply is, rather than state sovereignty is something socially constructed, enforced, and defended, and shaped to mean a very particular thing. So what I'm getting at here then is before the state, what happens before the state? We had diverse ontologies of land. And here, I'm not trying to be deeply, confusingly philosophical here. What I mean about ontology in this context is, what is the starting assumptions, the things that that require no evidence, upon which you will then build, epistemologies capable of creating systems of knowledge. So you can think of it as your starting assumptions, but ones that are necessarily systematic. And I'll say more about that. Before we can think about sovereignty as a fact, we need to consider what those ontological assumptions underscoring the fact are, and what its different genealogies mean for understanding sovereignty, states, colonialism, and ultimately decolonization. Let's start in South Asia with a consideration of what sovereignty looked like from a nominally Buddhist and Kandyan Sri Lankan perspective. So drawing on excellent scholarship by the acclaimed Sri Lankan scholars Gananath Obesekar, S.J. Tambaya, and Roshan De Silva Wijayaratna, and many others who've studied statehood in Buddhist Southeast Asia, we have a geometry of the state here that's circular in nature, and no doubt a good deal more familiar to you in India than maybe some of us in North America. Tambaya describes this as the galactic mandala form of sovereignty, with more than 2,000 years of political history grounded in South Asian political theory and statecraft. In the context of 19th century Sri Lanka, which is the time and place I spend most of my time thinking about, we can envision a political order in which the galactic core, right here, the galactic core, is inhabited by a bodhisattva king who has attained nirvana, karmic perfection, but chooses to remain in mortal form in order to help others attain Buddhahood. Material power is wielded with greater autonomy the further out in the ordinals that you move. So greater material power and control is awarded to chiefs and the outer rims than is in the smaller rims over here. The idea of secularism, as we understand it today, is a meaningless notion, not because there's anything especially religious about this orientation, this spatial orientation, but only because the particular violence of history, the particular violence of European history that rendered secularism a necessary political project in Europe just didn't happen in South Asia in the same way. It is not that church and state are unified in the Buddhist ontology of sovereignty. I want to make that very clear. It's not that church and state are unified. This is how oftentimes I think Western interpretations of Buddhist statehood kind of make that mistake. It's rather that the categories of church and state are already irredeemably contaminated by Eurocentric assumptions about what religion is, what politics is, and what political order looks like. I'll return to the Buddhist state in the next part of my talk, but let's continue this study, the comparative study of sovereignty, by looking at other ontologies. So this one, I argue, is the hegemonic one, and probably one that we're all implicitly aware of. This is John Locke, who's not the theorist by any means, but he was a really important one in terms of helping to naturalize and normalize a particular understanding of what land is based on property. And in this sense, he's really important to understanding the history of property. So Locke, in his fifth book on the second treatise on government, has a whole book dedicated to thinking about this problem of property. And the thing I want to point to here is that his sources of evidence is almost exclusively the book of Genesis. Now, I don't know about how you all teach your classes, but generally speaking, if my students come and hand me a paper where they only have one source of evidence, I'm going to send them back to the drawing board. But this was considered okay if that source was, you know, the cosmological center of the universe for these people. So he relies, as a result of working from Genesis, he relies on a preconceived consensus on that which is, in order to proceed in scaffolding his argument. That is the Christian worldview, or the Christian understanding of creation. And to give you a sense of why that's significant, if we look at Genesis 1:26, it's written, at least in translation, then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image and our likeness, so that we may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along in the ground." And you might say, who cares what is written in Genesis, you know, thousands of years ago? But my point is not that Genesis is determining how we understand land. My point is that the influential theorists and actors and colonists who were universalizing their worldviews through the colonial encounter were influenced by this understanding. So it's an indirect kind of effect. And it relies, such thinking, and particularly if you've read this part of Locke's work, which I know perhaps some of you have, he uses the motif of indigenous people extensively in this area. And he relies on an understanding of race in which indigenous people are seen as being outside of history rather than agents of history in the way that Europeans are permitted to be. And the key point here is that land has only one meaning, and it has value when it's owned and improved. And in this sense, it's not a question of left-wing or right-wing perspectives, right? Because Locke's position that you make something your, as he says here in the Second Treatise on Government, quote, "As much land as a man tills, plants, improves, cultivates, and can use the product of, so much is his property." And he uses the example of a so-called Indian, by which he means an indigenous person, collecting water in a cup. And his argument seems fine, right? Like, who would argue that a person who collects water in a vessel makes that water his? But what's at stake ontologically here is an understanding of humanity as fundamentally and essentially separate, not just from water, but from the entire natural world. It exalts the human subject as someone special relative to all creation. And the attempt to ground a theory of property in natural law understands natural law purely in universal terms, where natural law and a Eurocentric Christian understanding of natural law is what's important. And as we'll see by the end of my talk today, it does not leave room for natural law in a Mi'kmaq context or in any other kind of ontological context. So universal sovereignty in the Eurocentric sense, and this is the famous cover of Thomas Hobbes's book, Leviathan, that also was published right around the time of the Treaties of Westphalia. Sovereignty and state sovereignty in the Eurocentric genealogy, it relies, as I mentioned, on a predominantly Christian cosmology. And that's not a criticism, that's a description. I don't actually have a problem with cosmology being incorporated into political systems. It's just a question of whose cosmology, how, and how they interact. So I've tried to be descriptive here. Second part is that it's relationally developed and hardened over 500 years of colonial entanglement. It's built in part, Hegel comes along much later, but it's built and scaffolded onto a Hegelian stage theory style understanding of the culmination of human organizational capacity in the state. And if you look at Hegel's lectures on world history and the state, if you read Gua's engagement with Hegel on those terms, you really see kind of Hegel's understanding of stage theory civilizational development that takes us ultimately to a kind of normatively Eurocentric Christian understanding of the world. And consequently, the Eurocentric understanding of sovereignty, it works like a telescope. It can see European ideas. If you imagine a telescope, it sees European ideas very clearly. but everything outside of the gambit of that narrow scope becomes very blurred, so that we only have the most rudimentary and not useful understanding of what Buddhist statehood means, or what Mi'kmaq statehood would mean, or Anishinaabe ones, for example. So I'm going to continue the tour of different ontological starting points here. So if we this is the Anishinaabe scholar Leanne Simpson, and as in her work, she describes fundamentally, and she does a lot of things. She's a prolific writer, and one of the core aspect of an Algonquin Anishinaabe understanding of well, it's really about land, but from land we can extrapolate from sovereignty. She writes about the essential relationship between humans, animals, and inanimate objects. So we see right off the bat that's at odds with the kind of Christian Genesis understanding. She also introduces the concept of kobad, which is linking chain across generations of nations, including more than human people. So these relations, they go across time, and they connect people, and the understanding of personhood is not one that's limited to Homo sapiens. We'll put it that way. And then importantly, the notion of natural resources is an alien concept here, because the riches of the earth are understood as gifts from your mother, as opposed to resources intended to be used for the purpose of improvement of land or economic conditions. And Simpson, she has a beautiful lecture that I think she's since turned into a book, talking about blockades. And in that lecture, she talks about the way in which her ancestors brought an Anishinaabe world into existence by getting up every day and engaging not in the white man's labor, but in the labor of life and the labor of reproducing the natural world. And she juxtaposes that with the way that developmentalist kind of settler colonialism understood that as a lack of things. They saw Indigenous people as doing nothing. And what Simpson argues is that we were doing lots. We were always engaged in this productive work, but our objective was to maintain this kind of balance, whereas your objective is to tear down, and like build up these big cities and that sort of thing. So a fundamentally different concept. And if we come back now to Mi'kmaq, where I am, this is Doreen Bernard, who is a Mi'kmaq grassroots grandmother. And, I know Doreen in terms of like organizing with her, but she's also done a little bit of writing. And I try where I can to always focus on the writing of Indigenous people, so that I'm not speaking on behalf of any Indigenous people. Here's how Doreen articulates this. The life, culture, and strength of the Mi'kmaq cannot be separated from the sacredness of water. We embrace our connection to Mother Earth and her lifeblood and our people, and we encourage all to remember that water is precious and that all life depends on it to survive. Again, a very different relationality at stake here. The thing to draw your attention to from this kind of whirlwind tour of ontologies of sovereignty is that, how can I put this? When we think about the way that states have come to operate, state law and that which is lawful is really an extension of state power beyond traditional violence in order to territorialize within its geographical claim, including institutions like the school, institutions like the penitentiary, all of these ways of kind of rewarding people and punishing people. Foucault has talked a lot about this, and the way, and also David Scott in terms of colonial governmentality, right? The state becomes the institution that monopolizes violence in a Weberian sense in order to condition its population and its subjects to think and accept certain things as inevitable. And the lie of universal reason encourages us to forget that there are actually pluriversal realities at stake all around us all the time, that speak to different kinds of sovereignties or sovereignties otherwise, however you want to articulate it. So it's not a question of different understandings of the same thing. We're not talking about how, oh yeah, there are lots of different cultural understandings of what land is. What I'm trying to get at here um, is that there are different realities that are taking shape and that are reformulating themselves in a dynamic regime of practice. So obviously, I'm not trying to suggest that, you know, an Algonquin or a Dene understanding of sovereignty is simply unaware of what a Eurocentric understanding of sovereignty is, nor a Buddhist one ignorant to what a Christian one is. Ontologies and worldviews are not things that exist in isolation from one another. They're constantly bumping up against one another. And sometimes that looks violent, sometimes that doesn't look violent. Sometimes it's a wonderful meeting. So I don't mean to be, you know, the last thing I want to do is suggest that there's a universal way that ontologies meet and worldviews meet. And it reminds me of the work of my friend Robbie Shilliam, who in a different context describes the notion of the decolonial option as one that requires not only deconstruction, but also a critical retrieval of marginalized cosmologies and delegitimized epistemes that might provide a keener insight and set of alternatives to present-day iniquitous global power structures. And that's really, I think, what this is all about. What we can learn from colliding, from taking, you know, the collisions of different ontologies seriously, is the very possibility of gaining keener insights from accessing what Shilliam calls the uncolonized hinterlands, but what I would call just, you know, accessing pasts that we should all think that we can claim, so that the solutions are not all coming kind of from a abstract future or from the West or wherever it is, you know, we want to isolate it from. So the colonial violence of understanding sovereignty to mean just one thing limits and constricts the meaning of being free from colonial rule, because it embodies the violence of colonization to the colonizer, without due respect for how the institutions that have been normalized over the long haul of colonial encounters continues to perpetuate colonial power absent European bodies. And I think this is a hugely important problem that we need to deal with both in post-colonial places and settler colonial places. And I'll spend the rest of our time together today talking about the colonial implications of two such cases before we can kind of think together about what the decolonial options arising from that might be. So here, travel in time with me, if you will, to March of the year 1815, in and around the Kandyan highlands of Lanka. Now, pictured here is the last free king of Sri Lanka. His name is Sri Vikrama Raja Singha, the last in a dynasty of rulers with roots in southern India, as well as roots within the Kandyan Sinhalese nobility. This was not an easy victory for the British, and in truth, the victory wasn't theirs at all. The Kandyan galactic mandala system was falling out of balance over the preceding 20 years, though in that period of time, Raja Singha had handily humiliated the British forces, as well as caught and executed his Maha-Adhikar, or chief minister, for colluding against Kandy with the British. And in an effort to restore order and legitimacy to his failing kingship, Raja Singha increasingly beautified the capital of the kingdom, using Rajakarya labor, a kind of king service it means, but it's like a corvée labor system that was many generations old, but understood to be one in which the citizens of Kandy would perform labor to the temple, to the king, to the irrigation systems. And it served as a kind of tax, but it was always understood as a tax that served the public good. But what Raja Singha was doing in the late stages of his rule was he was trying to shift that into kind of really more aesthetic projects in the capital, to which people who were outside of the capital coming in to do their work obviously didn't care about. They're, you know, this is an abuse. It was understood as an abuse of privilege. There are many possible reasons for why the Kandyan kingdom's galactic balance was slipping. One such explanation is the slow economic isolation of the historically cosmopolitan kingdom in the late 18th century, when the Dutch and then later the British managed to consolidate their rule across the maritime borders of the island. So economic isolation to kind of starve them out. Another is the fact that, Raja Singha's most trusted minister, and in fact his teacher when he was a young person, was plotting against him to have him removed, and he nearly succeeded in doing this in and around the year 1808, after failing to accomplish that task with the aid of British military forces a few years earlier. So there was 3 different attempts to kick him out of the kingship. And then another possible explanation is that after a few generations of Nayaka rule, so his dynasty, the Sinhalese aristocracy wanted to seize the opportunity to reestablish an ethnic Sinhalese monarchy in Kandy. Now, there may be a little bit of all of this happening at the same time, but I find the ethnic argument to be the most lacking of all of them, in part because the calcified perceptions of ethnic difference does not line up to the way race and ethnicity was understood in early 19th century Ceylon, Sri Lanka. Nor does it line up with the expectations of Buddhist kingship, which privileges balance over personality. But whatever the reason, in 1815, a series of events we can talk about later, if you wish, came together to allow a new chief minister to the king to defect to the British and then diplomatically guide the British forces through the Kandyan kingdom without a single shot being fired. It was a coup, obviously, more than a war. And with the arrest and deportation of King Raja Singha, the British governor, Robert Brownrigg, meets with the chiefs of Kandy to discuss the integration of Kandy into the jurisdiction of the maritime provinces. It's a little bit of what it looks like. It was a big celebration. It was much pomp and circumstance. All the ceremonial arrival of Brownrigg. There were really dramatic stories, the historicity of which are somewhat disputed, so I won't dwell on them too much. But what I take away from this is that it was a moment of sovereign ontological collision, where the expectations of sovereignty of the Christian British people collided with the expectations of sovereignty of the Buddhist Kandyan people. And to the British, who literally until this point understood the Kandyan interior of Lanka to be a frontier which ought to be ignored by order of the colonial office, incorporating Kandy into the colony of Ceylon was simply a matter of colonial subjugation. But not so for the Kandyans, who had a longer history of strategic diplomatic alliances on the one hand, and also a radically different set of expectations of what sovereign rule entailed. King George of England was proclaimed sovereign. But if that was to be the case, where was he? This is deterritorialized sovereignty at its finest, because the Kandyans, who were accustomed to seeing their sovereign perform his duties and obligations in the sacred city, were now told that the king lived thousands of kilometers away in England. But of course, it was much more than just that. And the ontological contradictions of the convention of that treaty itself were very much on display. For starters, this is what it looks like. And it's interesting, you can see it's written simultaneously in Sinhalese and in English. Even though lots of the signatories to the document sign their name in Tamil. So there's lots of different worldviews signified by languages coming into play here that give us lots of clues into what sovereignty looked like in this context. It was written side by side. Clauses 1 to 3 vilifies the cruelties and oppressions of the Malabar ruler, by which they mean Vikrama Raja Singha, and actually talks about the violation of the sacred duties of the sovereign. So it wasn't ignorance. They understood that there was some understanding that they had to do things different. It reflects 2 different temporalities, the Sinhalese year 1739 and the Christian year of 1815. And importantly, Clause 5, where are we here? Clause 5 talks about protecting the religion of Voodoo. So we've got one document that's understood in 2 really different meanings, depending on if you're British and depending on if you're Kandyan. Where did I leave off here? Right, okay. I did write some other notes here. So part of what the convention did for us, aside from measuring temporality, or the significance of measuring the temporality different, is that in the British calendar, and I say this in part, again, not to make fun of the British in any way, but rather to show how in some ways ontologically similar these worldviews can be. Because the British notion of time is actually based on the death of their living deity, Jesus the Christ, who's a different figure from Jesus of Nazareth. But I'm not a religious scholar, so I don't want to spend too much time getting into the kind of like cosmological dimension here. There are better people than me to do that. But the point is that why this isn't, this is why in part it shouldn't be seen as strange to understand two different ontologies meeting as equals. Should be able to kind of think through some of these problems, but that wasn't the case, because like Jesus the Christ in the in the Christian worldview, for the Kandians, the Dalada relic or the tooth relic there was a tooth from the Buddha's funeral that was housed in Lanka since Buddha died. This was a fundamentally important symbol of sovereignty in Lanka. But the issue is the British never took any of that seriously, and it came to haunt them in the subsequent decades because they didn't take that seriously. And this is because the two ontologies of sovereignty, which could have met as equals, did not meet as equals. They met in a conquering imperial relationship, at least from the vantage point of the British. And this produced in Lanka in 1815 galactic imbalances. So, as I mentioned, Clause 5 of the convention reified the dominance of Buddhism, or what they called the religion of the Buddha, and yet 2 weeks later, Governor Brownrigg had given Wesleyan Methodist missionaries who were having dinner with him at his house reason to believe that, quote, the interior was now open for the gospel, end quote. And as scholars like James Duncan and Nahel Pereira have shown, the project of territorializing the city of Kandy, to deterritorialize the Bodhisattva core and re-territorialize legible British colonial space, was immediate. The king's throne room was repurposed as a library, and rebellion was afoot within less than 2 years. And there's lots of twists and turns in this rebellion and the many insurrections that followed in the coming decades, as Kumari Jaiwadina's book, Perpetual Ferment, outlines in great detail. In my book, I do much the same in my book, Pluriversal Sovereignty and the State. But in my take, what makes mine a bit different is that what's happening is an ontological disagreement about what sovereignty looks like and what sovereignty needs to do. And the consequence of this ontological collision is not that the British Christian model subsumes the Kandian Buddhist one, but rather both systems collide, and out of this collision, reformulate each other, but on profoundly different terms. And the way that I do this in my book, I make an analogy with galaxies, because scientists believe that the Andromeda galaxy and the Milky Way galaxy are ultimately going to collide in about 4 billion years. And, I won't show you the video. There's artistic renderings of what that looks like. And when I saw it years ago, it gelled with me in terms of thinking how sovereignty works, because when galaxies combine or collide, they're not bumping into each other like this. They pass through each other, and the forces of gravity within any given part of it will capture bits and pieces from the other, and something altogether new emerges out of it. So this is why I chose this image for the cover of my book, to capture what's happening at the pluriversal level here. So where did I leave off? One of the many outcomes of the ontological collision was that after more than 2 decades of anti-colonial resistance, in which the purpose of anti-colonial organizing was to get rid of the British and the British colonial system of governance, eventually the objective became merely to get rid of the British, but to keep the colonial system of governance. And in my work on this specific case, I focus on the norm of what I call total territorial rule, or the need for the government to exercise total, unflinching authority over the entirety of the island, which is absolutely not consistent with the principles of pre-colonial Buddhist statehood, nor the empirical reality that multiple sovereigns were operating on the island prior to 1815. The method, however, is to look for historical examples of ontological collision and then to study the particularities of that collision. So travel forward with me, if you will, to the 21st century, a journey that will give the historians among us whiplash, but recall the chilling statement of Sri Lankan President Mahinda Rajapaksa at the end of an anachronistically brutal civil war between Sri Lanka and Tamil when he says, quote, "We are a government that has defeated terrorism at a time when others told us it was not possible. The writ of the state now runs across every inch of the territory, of our territory," end quote. Where was the obsession with the writ of the state dominating every inch of territory in the Rajamandala, or more precisely, the Galactic Mandala system? It was not present. And this is not because I'm trying to commit the cardinal sin of post-colonial analysis, whereby we valorize the past as somehow being better than the present. There were lots of things that were awfully wrong with the way that Buddhist statehood operated too. But all I'm trying to do is to mark the difference and to show how the collision helped to spur a political situation of ethnic and religious supremacy in a way that would simply not have been conceivable prior to the 19th century. There are lessons that we can learn here, and we'll return to it shortly. Some of my graduate students are working on similar concepts, but in the Indian context, particularly in light of communal violence. And you know, like the approach, I think, is significant. But we're going to switch gears here in the last bit of the talk to talk about the Mi'kmaq fisheries. What might the method of ontological collision help us see if we were to apply it to contemporary clashes of sovereignty? So join me in Mi'kma'ki, where we can consider how a Mi'kmaq ontology of sovereignty is still colliding with what we might call a British-Canadian understanding of sovereignty, and producing a sense of cognitive dissonance here in the settler colony. So as I explained in the first part of the presentation, the Mi'kmaq have lived here since time immemorial and developed their language, laws, customs, all in tandem with the land on which they lived and the waters on which they kept. And the ongoing conflict that I'm talking about here, where I live, is one over the right to fish. Who has the right to fish? How much can they fish? And when can they fish? And in many ways, it's, you know, a fairly ordinary kind of domestic dispute, except there's nothing at all domestic if we take Mi'kmaq sovereignty seriously. Instead, this needs to be understood as an international dispute. But even if we follow the logics of the Canadian colonial court system, 20 years ago, the courts ruled that the Mi'kmaq had a right to fish for what they called a modest income. But that modest income could be fished at any time they wished, because, you know, they were treaty holders. As treaty holders, their rights are not regulated by the rights of settler commercial fishers who control the majority of rights to fish off the coast of Nova Scotia. The legal principles of the Mi'kmaq are vastly older than the legal principles of the Canadian colonial court. And the court called upon the government, even though the court essentially ruled in favor of the Mi'kmaq, they'd said, you know, the court can't legislate. So the court asked the government to legislate to create a context that would, you know, control this situation. But the government never did it. They had no interest in it. After 20 years of waiting patiently, Mi'kmaq lobster fishers in Mi'kma'ki launched their own self-regulated. If the government was going to issue the law, we have the laws. So the argument goes, we have the knowledge of conservation necessary to regulate ourselves. So the Mi'kmaq fishers launched just a few years ago, and it was met with enormous and immediate violence from the white fishers who owned commercial fishing licenses on the basis that the Mi'kmaq were fishing out of season in a way that would ostensibly diminish the stock of fish, lobster in particular. So that's like the nuts and bolts of what's happening, you know, and it's creating these situations of colonial cognitive dissonance. This is my sort of caricature that I tried to draw with stick figures to explain what's happening. Now, this is something that might be less familiar to our colleagues in India, but across North America, it's very common to have land acknowledgements where, you know, people here will say, you know, I'm on unceded territory, but they don't apply that materially to mean anything. So here's one stick figure saying, well, I recognize that I'm on unceded territory, but everybody should follow the rules, otherwise anarchy and stuff. And then the other guy says, but mobs of white people killed lobsters to conserve lobsters, and the Mi'kmaq fishers caught these lobsters following the rules. So there's this cognitive dissonance that's happening where, on the one hand, fishers, for sure, the white fishers, but also a significant portion of the settler population want to understand and domesticate this issue as one of ecological conservation. But ontologically, that is completely different from how, a Mi'kmaq worldview would understand this issue. Where was I here? Yeah. It's an international dispute. And even if we follow the logics of the court system, no, wait, I already read that part. Sorry. Here we are. So you can see immediately how the settler colonial argument tries to rationalize the problem through domestication and to make it about conservation rather than fundamentally about sovereignty. But what is at stake at the international dimension and the complexities of sovereignty understood in pluriversal terms, where Mi'kmaq sovereignty understood as ontologically distinct way of relating to land and water in relation versus the kind of private property resource understanding that we heard about in Locke, there's a clash here that's happening, and it's unfolding in real time. Whereas the other one in Sri Lanka unfolded historically, and we can kind of follow what we have in the records. We're now living through the same kind of ontological collision. And in practice, what happened was that mobs of white people attacked indigenous fishing vessels, including their lobster pens, destroyed the lobsters, burned the equipment, assaulted the fishers, and they did this ostensibly all in the name of conservation, which is part of what makes this, cognitive dissonance in my mind. And it's not that people don't know, and this is one of the things that's maybe a little different about right now, because Mi'kmaq scholars and water and land protectors have described, theorized, explained, and put into practice strategies intended to draw on the best practices of Mi'kmaq worldviews and the world of Western science. The ontologies of sovereignty at play here in the settler colony is such that the government is either incapable or unwilling to understand that it is meeting the Mi'kmaq as equals. In order to meet the Mi'kmaq as equals requires a total rethink and a reevaluation of how the Canadian state operates on unceded and unsurrendered territories. And here I'm just putting up, this is an open access article that I really encourage everyone to look for and read. And it spells out a lot of different things, in the context of conservation, but it recognizes, it brings Mi'kmaq science into conversation with Western science, and it, introduces concepts like Itupmunk, which Sherry Pictou really worked with me to help me come on side with. I had my suspicions about that. Not because I doubted what the Mi'kmaq were saying, but because I doubted what non-Mi'kmaq people were capable of doing with that. And this is, conventionally called two-eyed seeing, that tries to bring the very best from a Mi'kmaq worldview and the best from a Western worldview to help see a complete image together. You see processes about what the gathering of truth means and honoring relationships, the methodologies of storytelling and spending time with one another. It's a very different way, I think you can see, of doing science. And I'm not going to get into the details because I'm not Mi'kmaq and I don't want to misrepresent anything, but you go and read that piece. And the last, coming up on the very end here, I don't even know what time it is. I hope I didn't talk too much. But I want to say is that, the violence of centuries of genocide and Indigenous dispossession here in Canada have universalized an understanding of reality in Eurocentric terms that people continue to struggle with, even when Mi'kmaq join the Canadian parliamentary system as senators and write reports explaining it to everyone, as Senator Dan Christmas here did, in trying to explain the difference between natural law in a Eurocentric and a Mi'kmaq sense. And then the upper chamber in Canada is supposed to be a place for sober second thought. And this is kind of exactly what Senator Christmas did. He wrote, it was a 57-page report that holds people's hands and explains Nituklamink and explains like why Mi'kmaq conservation is actually better and should be emulated by the state rather than treated as hostile. But there we are. So the last thing, and this is just very preliminary, what kind of decolonial options emerge when we think about sovereignty and ontological collision? The first I would say is that we can think about ontological collision as kinds of historical critical junctures, as ways to help anchor our efforts to research. And that might take the form of archival research in the past, and it might take the form of different kinds of oral research, participatory action research in the present, because these ontological collisions are actually not relics of the past. They are kind of consistently tying the past and the present together in ways that limit the future. Sovereignty, I don't think, can be understood as universal. And this is something I wrote an article a few months ago in Review of International Studies that just outright attacked the way international relations universalizes sovereignty and said the discipline of IR can no longer talk about sovereignty if it continues to perpetuate the idea that sovereignty and the state system is as simple as the Eurocentric story wants it to be, when we know the realities. And I use the example of the Mi'kmaq fishers to make that case. The next thing I would say is we have to remember, because this is something I see all the time in considerations of political ontology, is that ontologies are not beliefs. They're not just beliefs. They're starting assumptions upon which systems of knowledge are based, and they need to be treated as such. And therefore, not everything is an ontology, right? Some thing that a person thinks is not an ontology. It's not the basis of a system of thought. There's criteria that we need to be honest about to determine what is someone's opinion and what is actually a historically situated starting point for knowledge construction. And finally, decolonization is always material. It has to be material, but it's not linear. So the options that we access in terms of framing how we build a decolonized future, they exist in the past and the present and the future, all at the same time. This is not a kind of thing that we have to look for new innovation all the time. The new innovation can come out of deep integration with historical research. And that was one of the things I really like about Roshan De Silva with Jaratna's work, because he also looks at the Kandyan Convention, and not just the convention, he looks at the practice of Buddhist kingship as a Sri Lankan trying to, access pre-colonial ideas to help manage ethnic crisis at the time of when he wrote that article. And I think that our pasts, whether we try to describe them as uncolonized hinterlands or whether we describe them as just sources of ideas that worked in practical ways to manage difference, we can resuscitate these ideas. And it might mean that we can't always access the colonial archive to do that. We need to, access alternative archives, family genealogies, all these other things. But the past can meaningfully decolonize the future if we're careful and serious about how we engage those pasts with kind of both feet planted in the present. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, everyone. I am at your mercy now for discussion.
Thank you, Ajay, for the wonderful talk. Now the floor is open for questions. We can ask questions.
I should say too, while you're thinking about your questions, I meant to apologize for my absurd background here. It's 6 a.m. and I was hiding from my family in hopes that if I went down into the basement, nobody would hear me.
Yeah.
Maybe I can.
Yeah.
I can begin. Hi, Ajay. Thank you so much for the talk. So, one of the very interesting aspects that I found was where you provided that photograph from the page, which had, the descriptions both written in English and also, I'm presuming, Sinhalese. Right.
Yeah.
So, I was wondering what is the intentionality behind it? Was it intended to create a situation which is based on the presumption that it would be unintelligible to either of the parties and thereby create some kind of hierarchy because was it like something like lost in translation or something intentionally kept some information in order to prevent the other party from understanding it. So I was just interested in knowing a little bit more.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for that question. It's a really important one. It's sometimes it's challenging to know for sure, what happened over 200 years ago. But based on all the things that I've read, I actually think, if anything, it was the opposite. It was, I think, a genuine effort by both the British and the Kandyan chiefs to understand each other. And it's part of the reason, in part, like there wasn't a lot of, at this time, there was not a lot of English understood in Kandy because they had been relatively isolated on purpose. It was their point of policy to isolate themselves from the maritime provinces of the Europeans for hundreds of years already. So they were developing for at least 2-3 generations now in relative isolation. And certainly, but the English were relatively new. If anything, people would have understood Dutch because the Dutch were there for a good 150 years prior to the arrival of the British at the beginning of the 19th century. So I think it was probably there's a really important figure I didn't talk about. His name was John Doyle. And he was the official translator of the British government. And he was the one who, with the Mahadikar, Aheapola was his name, who they were communicating with each other. And then they went and marched with the army up into Kandy and sacked Kandy in 1815. So Doyle was fluently bilingual, and he was probably influencing how they wrote these two columns. But I think while the issue is a question of translation that is related to ontology as well, because if we use the example of Turtle Island here where I live, this is something that Indigenous people have said. I remember Heather Marjorie talked about this in the context of Algonquin land claims in Ontario, where she said, until we can actually put up the word land in English and the word land in Anishinaabe and talk about what's different about what we mean, we're not actually even talking about the same thing. And I think that that's what happened here with the Kandyan Convention. When they say, sovereignty was ceded, or like the king is now King George, sure, we can put those words into Sinhalese, but if we put it only into Sinhalese, it lacks the kind of cultural and historical dimension that gives sovereignty meaning. Because that evolved, and Roshan De Silva's work does this really well. One of the important tasks of kingship was an annual parade, a parahera, where the king would be seen with all of the dignitaries and marching around the city with, and the presence really mattered in ways that was just not legible or understandable to the British. And on the British side, even though I think they probably genuinely meant what they were saying, they didn't know what the implications of what they were saying meant. Like if you were to say to the British in 1815, did you realize that you just made King George of England a bodhisattva king who's also simultaneously the Anglican appointed monarch for all of it? Like cosmologically, it doesn't add up. And those contradictions, I think were genuine. I don't think that they were. I wouldn't give the British or the Kandyan chiefs too much credit in terms of duplicitousness. Does that help?
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
So Ajay, I just have a question. So when we talk about sovereignty, what immediately comes to our mind is actually political sovereignty. So I was thinking about the other kinds of sovereignties that exist in the nations which had a colonial past. For example, I was thinking about religious sovereignty. Religious sovereignty.
Religious sovereignty?
Yeah, the national sovereignty within religion. So
Yep.
I often felt that, at least in the Indian context, it's not like two forces colliding with each other and one getting destroyed or both bouncing back. Especially in the case of Christianity as it is practiced here, we often feel that it's not like they are replicating the same notion of religious sovereignty from the West. On the other hand, it's a notion which is constantly in conversation with each other. So it's clearly informed by the rules and principles within Hinduism, and then the notion of sovereignty within Christianity, coming into contact with each other, and then finally a new mode is actually being created. So do you think that the situation is the same in the geographical locations you are talking about? That's the first part. The second part, do you see such appropriations when it comes to the notion of political sovereignty? Because correct me if I'm wrong, as far as I understand, the terrain of political sovereignty in nations with a colonial past almost looks the same as the political sovereignty as it gets practiced in the European terrain. So, do you think that this appropriation or the aberration of the idea of sovereignty in the religious or the spiritual realm is, I mean, or is the religious or the domestic realm the only place where the appropriation of the notion of sovereignty happens, or is it happening in the political realm as well, especially in the areas you are talking about?
Yeah. Thank you so much for those questions. Hugely important questions. And I would say, again, with the caveat that I'm not a religious studies expert by any means, but the example of what Christianity in India looks like, particularly the Christian communities that have been around for like 1500 years, demonstrates a completely different way, like I think a much better way through which ontologies met, merged. Because I said at the beginning, not every ontological meeting has to be violent, right? Not everyone has to be like conflictual in that way. And I think from what little I know, the arrival of the kind of long-term Christian community, it was a very different understanding of Christianity and practice, as you explained, set amongst the kind of broader Indianness, like whether we call it Hindu or whether we call it India, or whatever the culture is. But it happened differently from what the missionary project of the European colonizers were by the 19th century. And I think the reason why is actually not because of Christianity, but because of colonialism. Because when the older Christians would have been coming, the project was not colonialism. The project was talking about ontological difference and cosmological ideas in a context that was open to that. And I would go so far as to say, I think there was a lot in terms of even the arrival of Islam in India historically was not necessarily as violent as the kind of after the fact history tends to make it. Obviously, some of it was because it took political form in a really big way, which kind of brings me to the second part of your question about well, you also asked me to reflect on the religious sovereignty in Turtle Island. And again, with being neither Christian or indigenous, it's hard for me to speak authoritatively on that. But what I have observed is that there's no, like, a lot of indigenous communities across Canada and a lot of African communities across Canada identify very closely with Christianity. But what is empirically and undeniably true is that we went through a process of over 100 years in this country of what we call Indian residential schools, which were an institution of the colonial state set up to kidnap, torture, and eliminate indigeneity in young children. It was a really vicious part of the genocidal project, and these schools were open until the year 1997. They were kind of falling out of favor by maybe the 70s and 80s, but it was a very deliberate project that was run in part by the church, more significantly by the state, literally with the policy objective of, quote, killing the Indian and saving the child. So it was a project of cultural genocide, and part of that was literally beating children for practicing their own spiritual beliefs, punishing them, punishing them for even speaking their own language. These are things that are not commonly known about Canada. But, when I say that we are a vicious genocidal state in Canada, this is the basis of it. So I think that while it's true that there are now whole generations of Indigenous people who identify with Christianity, and it's very important for them, the way in which Christianity came was not peaceful in all cases. And I'm not trying to suggest that there were not instances where maybe it was peaceful and wonderful, but certainly the meta discourse there was not one of peace. But it is one that defines the colonial present in which we now inhabit, right? And that's the reality of how these worldviews coming together have manifested in ways that, people will continue to have to deal with those tensions. And about the way that political sovereignty works, then I do think that the kind of Eurocentric model has overrepresented itself as the only alternative. And it's the reason I think that's such an important question is because I don't want to be overly prescriptive in what I'm saying here, right? Like what I'm trying to get at is how have we arrived at this situation where the only source of political freedom appears to be having a seat at the United Nations, having total control over your borders, having the capacity to wage war. And I think even when we look at India, like the early political discourse of post-colonial India and Nehruvian foreign policy, although it was very much territorial and very much about protecting from recolonization, there was an interest in the early post-colonial period, not just in India, but across the post-colonial world, to articulate a different way, the Third World Project, right? A different way of articulating freedom. And what happened was that the United States started assassinating people who were trying to put that into practice over a 2-decade period. And that had a real chilling effect alongside neoliberalism, which is kind of a separate issue. So my take on what sovereignty means in the political realm is that the possibilities of alternatives, and I'll use maybe for a concrete example, let's use the example of Grenada and Maurice Bishop. And I use this example because the way I know about it is because my father was a Trinidadian journalist who knew Maurice Bishop personally. And Bishop, ostensibly what happened was it was a CIA coup, and they killed him. They accused him of being a communist sympathizer. But based on what my father has told me and what the history that I've looked at suggests, is that Bishop wasn't a communist necessarily. And even if he was, that doesn't justify his assassination. But what he was doing in Grenada was political innovation, where he would say, we don't have money to build the school and the hospital that we need. So my cabinet and I are all going to go and work in the field for a few days because we have a labor shortage. And it was just practical, what do we do as a tiny island state? We don't have enough resources, but we have people. And what it was doing was articulating an alternative to how society needs to operate. And that was an existential threat to either the Soviet worldview or the American worldview. And for that reason, people were removed, right? Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso. There's so many instances where political ingenuity was punished rather than rewarded. And I think we've reached a point in international society where we cannot afford to allow innovators of sovereignty to be punished in this way, because we're moving to a point of no return, both in terms of sovereignty and ecology. And I've written a piece a few years ago with my friend Lisa Tilley, who's at SOAS, where we were trying to think about environmentalism and indigenous protective ontologies, where the only conclusion that we could draw is that the best way that we can think ourselves out of climate emergency or think about decolonization would actually be to valorize and put at the front of the conversation these indigenous ideas about conservation and political sovereignty. Not to say that indigenous people have a responsibility to save the world that they didn't have any part in destroying, but rather to say, as a human society, as a human community, we need different leadership, because the political leadership of contemporary modernity has taken us basically to the shit show that we all live in right now. And we need fresh leadership and fresh ideas, and that's not going to come from a new prime minister. You know, it's going to come from changing the way that we think about political decision making. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, Ajay. Yes,
Yes.
Vinci.
Hello, Professor. Thank you so much for the talk. My name is Vinci. I'm basically working on intersection of caste and Christianity.
Oh, cool.
Okay, I've been reading missionary records regarding slavery. So, in which we do that, missionary records are the early documents from where we get to know about the slave history or slave memories in Kerala, specifically in Kerala. So, in the early records, I found missionary interpretations, especially the memories of the slaves, indigenous community. After Christianization, they have, the missionaries' conversation with this indigenous people, and they recorded it. But towards the end of not towards the end of 19th century and 20th century, and these people they started writing about their own memories. So I was wondering, after reading the memories of previous slaves, people from the slave caste, I found something really interesting. Like missionary records, they talked about violences, but in slave memories, they talked about different kind of violence, like emotional violence and all. So I was wondering whether the community, Mi'kmaq community, the way they express their this kind of conflicts, risks, and their internal conflicts and all. Are there any oral tradition or any textualized oral tradition and all? Yes, that's my question.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a wonderful question and wonderful research that you're doing as well. Thanks for sharing that. There's a lot of this. So we recently went through in Canada something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what that did was it created a national platform where Indigenous people, particularly survivors of colonial violence, broadly speaking, but in particular residential schools, they would go to these hearings and they would file their assessments, their memories about what they experienced at the hands of religious orders, at the hands of the state, at the hands of their families, at the hands of their chiefs, what have you. And it was an incredibly emotionally massive, I don't know how else to describe it, massive undertaking. And for Indigenous people, I think the outcomes have been mixed. From the state perspective, they'll use these documents as a way of coming up with a monetary payment to try and pay back the debt of that suffering, which of course is completely impossible. And it hasn't been met with. So what happened was a lot of re-traumatization for people who are deeply traumatized by the process itself. And many of whom I think feel completely abandoned and re-traumatized on top of it. But for many other people, Doreen Bernard is one of them. Like, she talks a lot about how having the space to make that testimony was a very important part of her own healing and their own understanding. I've heard, again, I don't want to speak for Indigenous people, and in this sense, I don't really have to, because that report, if you're interested, and I think it would make for some really interesting comparative research for you, it's all publicly available, and it's like thousands of pages. The full report of people's oral testimony is written. There's a much shorter version that talks about all of the findings that come out of it. That's maybe, I don't know, 200 pages, 300 pages long, but the whole record is publicly available. And it's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It came out in 2015. So yeah, I guess I would say, to really know what it is they think, you should check their transcript there. And I would reserve. I don't really know what I think I can ethically reflect on without kind of overly editorializing, right, with my own biases on that front, because it's complicated. It's really deeply complicated in ways that I think you'll know. Like, we see that complexity when we read missionary archives. I relied extensively on missionary archives for a lot of my learning about this time period. And one of the wonderful things about them is that it's not one story that you get in the missionary archives. You may have some missionaries who are, compelling intellectuals, defenders of moral truth and justice, and then others who are completely awful human beings. They're like any other different group of people in that respect, but their way that they understand society that they're embedded in tells a really big story. Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions
Questions online now.
If any online participants. Yeah.
John?
Hi everyone, it's so nice to be here. There's a lot of echo. Maybe my question will be brief, but if you want to turn off your mics while I ask it, just so you can hear it. Thank you. So nice to be here. Ajay, thank you. There was so much in your talk. I mean, it's hard to go like 2 minutes without thinking of Gaza, of course, on all of our minds. But it also feels like there's a bit of an opportunity to think with your talk in terms of what's happening. And, we think the two-state solution versus the one-state solution kind of is such an example of presupposing a universalist view of sovereignty that you have just so thoroughly got us to think about it in new ways. So this puts you on the spot a bit because this wasn't exactly what you were talking about, but it just seems so salient. Are there ways that you're thinking of, even if you're not doing this as exactly research, but just something that we're all thinking about? Is there ways that your argument actually can put a light on what's happening to the people of Palestine that might get us somewhere? I'll just put it that way. And thanks again. This is a great session.
Thanks, John, for that question. It's something, Palestine obviously is something that I think a lot about, even though I don't write about it. And if I'm being honest, like a lot of my early research was about Palestine as a graduate student, in part because, and then one of the reasons I stopped researching Palestine and instead turned to, India, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, and the Caribbean was because I felt like the situation facing Palestinians was so indefensible and so, there was just I felt like I had nothing that I could say that would be useful there. And if anything, it's like I decided to focus on activism related to that. But now that I'm a little bit older and read a little bit more, I actually think that there's lots that can be applied here, particularly in terms of centering the humanity of people. Because if you look at the discourse, right, like the way that nationalism affects history is well documented. And the big things that we hear now coming from organized Zionist interests is the historical erasure of Palestine as a people and as a state. And they rely on these universalist discourses that are legalistic in framing to say, well, there was we were always here first, Judea, etc., all the way back to the Roman times. And they use that discourse of what the state is to kind of isolate and erase Palestinian presence. But what they forget, and I think I would extend this also to the way that, Hindu nationalism operates in India in terms of trying to vilify the Muslim and the Christian and all the other minorities. There's this tendency to focus on the state as if the state is not comprised of the people. And when I think about Palestine and I think about Israel, it, the conditions, historical conditions that affected, the framing of Judea 2,000 years ago, and then what would later be called Palestine, we're talking about much the same people. And they took on a different religion, sure. Some became Christian, a lot more became Muslim in Palestine. And then they're treated as if they're separate people when they're not separate people. If we look at people, and instead of asking what state do you belong to, we ask, what is your genealogy? What is your family's genealogy? And you trace that genealogy back 1,500 years to the same land. we have to ask ourselves, are we privileging the existence of a state, or are we privileging the existence of people who live amongst many states that come and go? And, like places like when you look at Indian history and you look at the rise and fall of different empires and different political jurisdictions, I feel like what has been consistent is that ordinary human beings have generally stayed in the areas in which they've lived for generations immemorial. And obviously with Israel and Palestine, that wasn't always historically the case, because Jews were taken away and displaced from that territory. But that also doesn't mean that the way of returning to that territory has to be through total territorial rule, absolute control of borders, and the ethnic purification of a population. And that has been the way, because that is what the logic of the modern territorial nation state has taught us. And I think that's why it's been so tremendously limiting in that respect. So, honestly, like from what I've heard from, a lot of my close Palestinian friends, has been like the two-state solution could never really work, because there would never be a viable Palestinian state allowed to exist. So what most people are actually asking for is just a single democratic state. But Israel is not a democratic state. Israel is a Jewish kind of supremacist state where citizenship and religion are kind of tied together, and you're vilified by virtue of your Palestinian existence and treated as a second-class citizen. So what a lot of the Palestinians that I've been chatting with and organizing with are saying is, just make us full citizens of the state. Even like that would be one way to do that, but it would require a rethink of the purpose of what Zionists like to call the Jewish state, but what loads and loads of Jewish people internationally have always said is just, a state that ought to be democratic. And in that sense, we're not holding it to any other standard that we would expect, and to kind of make that argument about India a little bit too, the vilification in the last 5, 6, 7 years, when did Modi get elected? 2014, I think. The vilification of minorities, and in particular Muslims, in India also presupposes the fact that, the discourse that Muslims were an invading, occupying order. Well, yeah, maybe some of them were, but the vast majority of people were actually the same people who were living on the same land who decided to follow a different religion, in the same way that, the Christians from, even older did the same thing. So the othering, like in my other work, I've called it, when I looked at the civil war in Sri Lanka and Tamil Eelam, I called it territorializing the enemy other, in the context of the global war of terrorism at that point. And it's just a way, Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism does the same thing today. And now, while they've sort of felt like they've dealt with the Tamil separatist threat, now they're turning their attention to the next ethnic group and the next one. So I think it's been one of the great crises of the post-colonial moment, is that rather than continuing to innovate and develop and build that third world project that had all the optimism of the 1940s and 50s, we've instead kind of, to some extent, given up, at least at that elite level, and said, no, we're just going to be a state like any other. And that's why when I say, like India and Sri Lanka in particular, because they're the ones that I know the most about, they're the ones that are at times deploying tactics of settler colonization. Whether that's in Kashmir, whether that's in Jaffna, and they're learning and understanding that this is acceptable in the international system. And I think we really have to make sure that that's not the case. But thank you, John, for the question. I think Palestine is always relevant, and we should always be thinking and talking about it.
Any more questions? Then
I think Ajay.
Ajay?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I don't think we'll have any.
I don't think we have any more questions. Yeah.
Great. I actually do have to run as well. So.
Thanks a lot. It was really wonderful, and we thoroughly enjoyed it. Look forward to working with you more.
Yes.
Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone. Thanks Sujarita, John,
Thanks, everyone.
Professor Humble. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
All the best, everyone.
Thanks a
Okay,
lot.
bye.
Yeah.
getting local.